So, um, imagine over 1 billion people in South Asia basically pulling off this half-century economic miracle.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about leaping out of extreme poverty, building this booming service sector, but
But
they,
there's always a catch, right?
yeah, a massive one. They accidentally built, well, like $100 billion debt bomb and a huge carbon trap right alongside it.
Which is terrifying when you look at the scale.
Exactly. So today we're looking at why the world's greatest growth engine might be, driving straight off a cliff. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
So for you listening, today we are unpacking this incredibly detailed, data-driven academic report on the structural transformation of South Asia.
It's a dense report, but it's fascinating.
It really is. And the core question we are trying to answer today is basically this. Are we looking at a structural economic miracle, or is it an entirely unsustainable growth trap?
Yeah. And honestly, that is the defining geopolitical and economic question for that entire region right now. And to really understand it, we have to look at these numbers impartially. Our goal today isn't to take political sides on debt policies or fossil fuels.
Right. No politics, just the data.
Exactly. Our mission is strictly analytical. We just need to follow the numbers to understand the mechanics behind this paradox. Like, how do you simultaneously lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty while creating systemic risks that could wipe all that progress out?
It's wild. And the report actually opens with this visual that I think perfectly captures the tension.
Oh, the arrow graphic.
Yeah. So picture this, just a minimalist white background. And right in the middle, there's this dark gray upward arrow, which, represents the GDP growth.
Right, the miracle part.
Exactly. But then casting this massive, heavy, deep red shadow underneath it.
Which is circled in red just to make it extra
Wait,
careful.
circled in red, that shadow represents the debt and the carbon emissions. It's literally weighing down the progress.
It's a great visual metaphor.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have to start with the absolute growth.
We do. Act 1 is basically the accumulation of a miracle.
Right, because if you just look at the top line numbers, it looks like an unmitigated triumph. We are looking at a half century of relentless economic accumulation.
The historical leap is undeniable.
Yeah, the first chart is just this dark blue line showing per capita GDP. And this is in constant 2015 US dollars, so it's adjusted for inflation.
Which is crucial for an accurate picture.
Right. So the numbers jump from roughly $331 to breaking the $1,770 mark.
Yeah, look at the slope at the end of that chart.
Yeah, they use this dash arrow to show the start and finish, and then they literally draw a circle around the last few years because the line just goes almost vertical.
It's a steep climb.
But I have to play devil's advocate right out of the gate here.
Go for it.
When you listening see a number like average GDP per capita multiplying by 5 times, how much of that is just the rich getting massively richer?
It's a very fair question.
Because, does a leap from $300 to $1,700 actually change the reality on the ground for 1 billion people?
Averages can absolutely obscure inequality.
Yeah.
And South Asia certainly has its share of billionaires, right?
Well, definitely.
But when you start at a baseline of $300 a year, we have to understand what that number actually represents in absolute terms.
Right. What does $300 buy you?
Well, $300 a year isn't working class.
Yeah.
It isn't even paycheck to paycheck. It is absolute grinding subsistence survival.
Wow.
It means if the monsoon fails, people literally starve. So moving an entire region from $300 to over $1,700, it fundamentally alters the floor of human existence.
So it's the difference between like a dirt floor and a concrete floor.
Exactly.
Between hoping it rains and actually having a mechanical irrigation pump.
Precisely. It means millions of families crossing this threshold from bare caloric survival into a state where they can actually begin to consume.
Right, participating in the economy.
Right. Purchasing a bicycle, putting a tin roof on a house, buying a cheap smartphone, or, being able to afford basic antibiotics.
Which is huge.
It is. From a purely macroeconomic perspective, the sheer momentum required to move a population of that size that far up the income ladder.
Yeah.
It's staggering. You are untethering 1 billion people from the absolute whims of nature.
Okay, so the momentum is real. The floor has been raised. But how did they actually generate that momentum?
That's where the demographics come in.
Because you don't just magically quintuple your economic output without a fundamental shift, right?
Yeah.
And the data points to something economists are totally obsessed with.
The demographic dividend.
Yes, the
Yeah.
demographic dividend. And the numbers here in the report are just wild.
They really are.
So a few decades ago, the youth dependency ratio,
Meaning the percentage of kids who need to be supported by working adults.
right, that ratio was hovering around basically three-quarters of the entire population, like 76.5%.
A massive burden on the workforce.
Exactly. But today, that has plummeted down to roughly 56.7%.
While the elderly population barely moved.
Yeah. The elderly dependency only crept up a tiny bit, from around 5% to 7.7%.
This is what we call the scissors gap.
The report has a great chart for this, right?
Yeah, it uses this dark teal line for the dropping youth dependency and a light gray line for the flat elderly dependency. And when you look at them together, the lines open up exactly like a pair of scissors.
And the space between the blades is filled with this light gray shading labeled the golden window.
Right, and that empty space between those blades is basically the defining macroeconomic feature of the late 20th century for developing economies.
Why is that?
Because it represents a massive temporary surplus of working-age adults. Society generates this huge labor surplus.
Let me try to put this into everyday terms for you listening, just to make sure we're getting the mechanics right.
Sure.
Imagine you live in a household, right? And for years, there's only one person working, but they have to feed, clothe, and pay for, say, 5 dependents.
A bunch of kids and maybe a grandparent.
Exactly. So every single cent that comes in the door goes right back out just to buy rice and shoes.
There are absolutely zero savings.
Right. But then, over 20 years, those kids grow up, and they don't have as many children of their own, and they all get jobs.
The dynamic completely changes.
Right. Now, suddenly, instead of having 5 dependents for every earner, you only have 2.
That is exactly how it works on a micro level.
Okay.
Now, just multiply that household by hundreds of millions. When a society hits that demographic golden window, you have way more people producing value than consuming value.
And that theoretically turbocharges the economy.
Oh, absolutely. It completely transforms your national economy through the mechanism of savings.
Walk me through that mechanism. Like, how exactly do fewer kids equal an economic boom?
Well, when households aren't spending all their income on sheer survival and child rearing, they start putting money in the bank.
Okay, makes sense.
And the national savings rate skyrockets. In a developing economy, bank deposits are basically the ultimate fuel.
Because the banks can lend it out.
Exactly. When savings go up, banks suddenly have vast pools of capital to lend. Domestic businesses can borrow to invest in new machinery, they build factories, buy delivery vehicles.
Upgrade their technology.
Right. And the cost of borrowing drops because capital is suddenly abundant.
Yeah.
So productivity surges. You get this massive injection of both human labor and investment capital at the exact same time.
Okay, I get that. But the data makes it really clear this isn't just some spontaneous natural event.
No, it took a lot of work.
Right. This demographic window opened because of massive, deliberate victories in public health and education.
Securing the base, basically.
Yeah. You can't have a productive workforce if half your population doesn't survive childhood. And the data on infant mortality here is genuinely moving.
It's one of the most important charts in the report.
It's this smooth, dark blue declining curve. We are looking at a society where the infant mortality rate was once terrifyingly high. Like, nearly 10% of live births didn't survive.
A rate of 9.9.
9.9. And they draw this red circle around that early high point. But then, over consecutive decades, that number just drops off a cliff.
It's a monumental victory in basic human survival rights.
It's a profound victory. But I have to ask, how exactly does saving infants trigger this macroeconomic boom? Because it seems counterintuitive at first. Wouldn't more surviving babies mean a higher youth dependency burden?
In the very short term, perhaps. But human behavior is highly adaptive.
How so?
Historically, in agrarian societies with high infant mortality, families have, 6, 7, or 8 children.
Right.
Because they know, statistically, several of them will tragically not survive to adulthood. It's a brutal form of biological insurance.
Right, because you need surviving children to work the farm.
And to care for you in your old age. Because there's no Social Security or 401k. Your children are your retirement plan.
Wow, yeah.
But when you introduce mass vaccination programs, clean drinking water, basic rural clinics, when mothers realize that the children they give birth to are actually going to live,
The behavior flips.
completely. Fertility rates crash. Families choose to have 2 or 3 children instead of 7. And this leads to the next crucial phase, human capital concentration.
Right, because if you only have 2 kids, you can actually afford to send them to school instead of needing them to weed the fields all day.
Precisely. And the state can actually manage the educational load, too. The data shows the pupil-teacher ratio in primary schools dropping significantly.
Yeah, from a severely strained 42.6 down to roughly 33.2.
The report has a scatter plot for this, right?
Yeah, with a downward arrow showing the burden on teachers lifting, which is basically the difference between a teacher just doing crowd control and a teacher actually being able to instruct.
Exactly. The resources are no longer diluted across this impossibly wide base. You are taking the same amount of national wealth and concentrating it into the health and education of a smaller, much more capable generation.
And that generation grows up to be the demographic dividend.
Yes, they are healthier, they are literate, and there are hundreds of millions of them entering the workforce all at once. You simply cannot build a complex modern economy on a sick, illiterate population.
It's the absolute prerequisite.
Right.
Okay, so Act 1 is complete. The stage is set. We have a massive, healthy, literate workforce with money in the bank.
Ready for Act 2.
Right? Act 2.
Yeah.
The structural metamorphosis. What do all these people actually do for a living now?
Because for thousands of years, the answer in South Asia was simple. You farmed.
Yeah, the wealth of the entire region was tied to the soil and the monsoon. But the data shows this absolute civilizational pivot.
Saying goodbye to the agrarian past.
The report uses this stepped area chart, light gray and dark gray, and it shows agriculture's share of the total economic output, the GDP crashing.
It was cut by more than half.
Yeah, there's a downward arrow showing it dropping from a peak of 44.2% down to roughly 16.7%.
A drop of over 60%.
It's wild. What does that actually mean on the ground?
Well, this is the hallmark of a structural transformation. It signals that South Asia has fundamentally broken away from its traditional, absolute reliance on agrarian models.
So they aren't captive to the seasons anymore.
Right. They are generating value through human organization, technology, and industry now.
But here's where South Asia's story kind of diverges from what we typically expect, right?
Tell so.
Well, if we look at the historical economic miracles like Japan in the 60s, South Korea in the 70s, China in the 90s, the playbook was pretty uniform.
Farm to factory.
Exactly. Farmers left the fields, moved to the cities, and went straight into massive manufacturing plants. They made toys, then textiles, then electronics, then cars.
The traditional industrial route.
But in South Asia, the data shows they took a totally different path.
What's fascinating here is that while industry did grow, from around 15% to over 24% of employment, it wasn't the main driver.
Right. The service sector exploded instead.
The report uses a stacked bar chart with blue and gray tones to show this.
Yeah, they highlight the service sector expanding from 21.7% to over 33.1%.
It became the primary reservoir, absorbing that massive influx of labor from the demographic dividend.
But why? Why bypass the traditional sweatshop to factory pipeline and go straight into services?
It's a fascinating anomaly.
Yeah.
Part of it is due to the lack of hard infrastructure in the late 20th century.
Like roads and power.
Exactly. To build a globally competitive manufacturing hub, you need deep-water ports, flawless superhighways, and incredibly robust power grids.
And South Asia struggled to build those fast enough.
They did. But what they did have was a growing telecommunications network, a legacy of English language education in certain regions, and a massive domestic market.
So it's the idea that building a massive auto plant takes 10 years and billions in concrete, but setting up an IT call center in Bangalore just requires office space, a satellite dish, and educated workers.
That's the high end of it, yes. The IT and software boom was a brilliant capitalization on their specific advantages.
Right.
But we have to be careful not to romanticize the entire service sector here.
What do you mean?
Services is a massive statistical umbrella. It includes the software engineer in a glass tower, absolutely.
Okay.
But it also includes the millions of internal migrants who move to Dhaka or Mumbai and end up, pushing a T-card or driving a rickshaw or working as informal security guards.
Oh, right. The informal service economy.
Exactly. It's a way to survive in the city when the formal factories aren't there to hire you.
That makes sense. But regardless of whether they are coding software or selling street food, this massive shift from rural farms to urban service economies requires an ocean of money.
It requires immense financial fuel.
And the report highlights exactly how this was paid for. We talked about bank deposits earlier. Well, the data shows domestic credit to the private sector absolutely skyrocketing.
From under 10% of GDP to over 50%.
The chart has this huge upward bend, and they actually mark the inflection point where financial deepening accelerates.
We really need to pause on the magnitude of that credit expansion, though.
Why is it so important?
Going from 10% to 50% financial leverage is literally what builds the modern world.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that, because credit expansion sounds like dry banking jargon, but it's actually kind of the magic trick of capitalism, right?
It is the financial deepening of a society. When credit is only 10% of GDP, it means the banks only trust the government or a few massive legacy conglomerates.
So an average entrepreneur is just locked out.
Completely. They cannot get a loan. But when it expands to 50%, the financial plumbing reaches the streets. It means a logistics company can borrow money to buy a fleet of delivery trucks. A developer can get a loan to build an apartment complex.
And a family can actually get a mortgage to buy one of those apartments rather than having to save cash under a mattress for 30 years.
Exactly. It accelerates the velocity of money. It provides the financial blood to the new service and industry engines.
Okay, so I think of it like this. If the demographic dividend provides the human engine, the credit expansion provides the high-octane financial fuel.
That's a great way to put it.
But you still need a literal spark to ignite the engine.
Right.
You can't run a service economy in the dark.
No, you cannot.
And the data shows an absolute milestone here. The report has this dual-axis chart showing urban population growth slowing down to around 1.6%, but urban electricity access.
It hit 97%.
97%. They put a little crosshair mark on the chart at that node.
Yeah.
It's a historic breakthrough.
Achieving near-universal urban electrification is the physical prerequisite for the modern era. You simply cannot run a service or industrial economy on intermittent power.
Right. A software company can't have its servers go down when the grid fails.
And a hospital cannot have its refrigeration fail when storing vaccines. Manufacturing lines cannot stop and start.
So this is crossing what they call the infrastructure bottom line.
Yes. Hitting 97% means the state capacity has finally matured enough to deliver complex, capital-intensive engineering projects to the vast majority of its citizens.
It proves they can build the baseload power required to compete globally.
Exactly.
Okay, so up to this point, if you are a global investor listening to these numbers, you are probably salivating.
It sounds like a perfect setup.
Right. They survived childhood, they got educated, they left the farms, they unlocked domestic credit, and they turned the lights on. It's an absolute triumph.
Well,
But here is where it gets really interesting and where the deep dive takes a serious turn. Because Act 3 of this report expanded the Achilles heel.
the structural mismatches.
Right. The researchers highlight glaring contradictions and massive social exclusions that threaten to just derail the entire miracle. And we have to start by going back to the farm.
Yes, the great productivity gulf in agriculture. This is perhaps the most glaring warning light on the macroeconomic dashboard.
So we established earlier that agriculture's contribution to the overall economy plummeted to under 17%. It's no longer the main driver of wealth.
Right.
But UT, and this is massive, but the data shows that agriculture still traps over a third of the entire male employment population.
Roughly 34.2%.
The chart for this is crazy. It's a dual-axis bar chart, and they draw this bright red connecting line between the tiny GDP share and the huge employment share.
Labeling it a severe productivity mismatch area.
Exactly. How is that possible? Why are tens of millions of men stranded in a sector that generates so little of the national wealth?
Well, a productivity mismatch basically means you have a massive chunk of your workforce generating very little economic value. And to understand why they are stranded, we have to look at the mechanics of land ownership and social safety nets.
Let's break that down. If the urban service sector is booming and farming only produces 16% of the wealth, why don't these guys just pack up and move to the city to get a service job?
Because the transition is incredibly risky.
How so?
If you are a laborer in a Western economy and you lose your job or change careers, there is usually some form of unemployment insurance, or at least a highly formalized job market to help you transition.
Right, there's a safety net.
But in rural South Asia, your only safety net is the family plot of land. If you move to the city and fail to find a steady job in that informal service sector we discussed, you don't just go bankrupt, you risk absolute destitution.
So the land is their insurance policy. They literally can't afford to let it go.
Exactly. And because of inheritance norms, these family plots are subdivided generation after generation.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, a grandfather might have farmed 10 acres. He has 4 sons. They get 2.5 acres each. They have sons. And suddenly you have adult men trying to make a living farming half an acre.
Which is mathematically impossible to do efficiently. You can't justify buying a tractor for half an acre.
Precisely. You can't mechanize. You can't achieve economies of scale. So these men are technically employed in agriculture, but in reality they're severely underemployed.
They might only be doing a few hours of genuinely productive work a day.
Right. This delays the transfer of labor and drags down the overall national efficiency. The economy is modernizing, but it is acting like a parachute, dragging a third of its men behind in a low productivity trap.
Wow. And if you think the men have it tough, I have to call a timeout here and look at the data on the marginalized female workforce.
This is a crucial point.
Because this completely blew my mind. We just spent 20 minutes praising the dropping infant mortality, the improved education, and the booming service sector.
A rising tide.
Right. But the data shows that female vulnerable employment remains at a dangerously high 76.7%.
It's mapped out on a dumbbell chart in the report, showing the cluster of vulnerable female workers.
Yeah, they circle it. Yes, it has slowly declined from 91%, but 3/4 of working women are still stuck in informal, unprotected, vulnerable jobs.
It's a staggering statistic.
I really have to push back on the whole miracle narrative here. If the schools are better and the economy is growing, why are 3/4 of working women still locked out of the formal economy?
It is a critical contradiction, and it exposes the limits of macroeconomic charts. Economic growth does not automatically erase deeply entrenched cultural expectations or patriarchal norms overnight.
Right.
This raises an important question about how societal norms and informal economies are resisting the macro-level progress. The reality is that the structural transformation has simply not been inclusive.
Walk me through the reality of that vulnerable employment. What does that actually look like for a woman in this economy?
Vulnerable employment means working without a contract, without legal protection, without maternity leave, and without a reliable income.
So zero security.
None. While female literacy and education have skyrocketed, the pipeline from the schoolhouse to the formal office is broken. Many women are absorbed into the informal economy because it is the only sector that accommodates or exploits their restricted mobility.
We're talking about the garment workers, right?
The garment industry is a massive part of it, yes. Millions of women in places like Dhaka work in textile factories where the regulations are often bypassed.
Which makes them highly vulnerable to economic shocks or workplace hazards.
Exactly. But it's also domestic labor, it's street vending, and crucially, it's piece rate work done inside the home.
What kind of work is that?
A woman might be sewing garments or rolling incense sticks in her living room for pennies per batch. She's technically generating economic output, but she is entirely invisible to the formal banking and legal systems.
Wow.
And then, of course, there is the unpaid family labor on those subdivided agricultural plots we just discussed.
So the macro-level progress, the rising GDP, the credit expansion, is actively bypassing them.
It is.
The golden window of the demographic dividend is open, but societal norms and informal economic structures are essentially acting as a bouncer, blocking a massive portion of the population from actually climbing through it.
That is an apt metaphor.
Yeah.
And it represents a staggering loss of potential. You simply cannot maximize a demographic dividend if you leave half your population in the economic shadows.
Which brings us to Act 4. The report calls this section the avalanches.
The threats to the future.
Yeah, these are the active existential threats. And this is where we have to talk about that massive red shadow hanging over the GDP growth from the intro.
The debt and the carbon.
Right. The first avalanche is the sword of Damocles, the debt black hole. And the data here is genuinely intimidating.
It's an exponential curve.
Yeah, the chart is just dark gray bars starting at 0, but by the end, the bars just explode upward, and there's this thick red warning box around the peak.
Warning of a black hole.
So, total external debt service, which economists call TDS, started off in the early years at a manageable $1.4 billion.
Right.
But it has aggressively mutated to an astronomical historical peak of over $106 billion.
$106 billion. And we must be meticulously clear about what that term means for you listening.
Okay, let's clarify.
We are not talking about the total debt accumulated over time. We're talking about debt service.
Let's break down the mechanics here. This is the amount they have to pay every single year just to keep the lights on with their creditors, right? Principal and interest.
Exactly. And to maintain our impartial lens, we have to understand the mechanics of external sovereign debt.
How is it different from normal debt?
This isn't like borrowing money from your own domestic banks in your own currency. External debt is almost always denominated in foreign currencies, predominantly the US dollar.
Why does that matter so much? Why is external debt so much more dangerous than domestic debt?
Because of currency risk. Economists sometimes refer to it as the original sin of developing economies.
Okay.
When a country borrows in dollars, they have to pay back in dollars, but they collect their tax revenues in their local currency. Rupees, taka, whatever it might be.
Right. They tax in local currency but pay in dollars.
Exactly. So if the global economy shifts, say, the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates, global capital flees back to the U.S., and the local currency depreciates against the dollar.
Oh, wow. So even if they didn't borrow a single extra dime, their debt just mathematically explodes because their own money is worth less?
Precisely. If your currency drops by 20% against the dollar, your debt burden effectively increases by 20% overnight.
That is terrifying.
And this creates the black hole effect the report highlights.
Yeah.
When your debt service reaches over $100 billion a year, current capital is aggressively bleeding out of the region.
Just to pay the interest.
Right. Every single dollar sent to a foreign bondholder is a dollar that cannot be spent on building a new technical college, cannot be spent on upgrading the electrical grid, and cannot be loaned to a local entrepreneur.
So it literally consumes the resources needed for future development. It consumes the future to pay for the past.
Yes.
That financial fuel we talked about earlier, that massive credit expansion that built the service economy, it came with a bill that is now compounding faster than their ability to pay it.
It threatens to completely bury all the progress we saw in Act 1. If the demographic dividend is a race against time before the population gets old, the debt avalanche is essentially tying weights to the runner's ankles.
Man, and as if that weren't enough, we hit the second avalanche, the carbon trap.
The environmental bill for this rapid modernization.
The report has this deep purple-gray area chart that just screams warning, because the data shows that as South Asia modernized, their reliance on fossil fuels didn't drop. It increased and locked in.
It locked in at roughly 73.2% of total energy.
And as a direct consequence, CO2 emissions, excluding land use, exploded. We're talking about a jump from 219 megatons to over 1,001 megatons of carbon dioxide.
They draw a trend line right over the chart, noting that carbon emissions are moving in perfect sync with GDP growth.
Right. It's like they traded their bicycle for a sports car. They're moving so much faster. They're off the subsistence farms. The GDP is way up. But the sports car runs on dirty coal. And they are now stuck in the driver's seat, flying down the highway at 80 miles an hour, completely unable to change the engine while the car is moving.
That analogy gets right to the heart of the concept of path dependency.
Expand on that. Why can't they just pivot? We see solar panels getting cheaper every year. Why are they locked in?
Because an energy grid is not just a technological choice. It is a massive, entrenched political and economic ecosystem.
What do you mean?
Once you spend decades building a grid that is 73% reliant on coal and fossil fuels, you have built thousands of miles of specific transmission lines.
Right.
You have built deep water ports designed entirely to receive toll ships. You have millions of workers whose livelihoods depend on mining, transporting, and burning that fuel.
So it's not just swapping out a plug.
Not at all. You have massive state-owned enterprises that hold immense political power. The data proves that South Asia's economic growth is walking in lockstep with carbon emissions.
Right.
From a purely impartial structural standpoint, they have entirely failed at economic decarbonization. They've created a high-carbon path dependency.
And to go back to my sports car analogy, if you turn off the coal plants to upgrade them to green energy, the car crashes.
The economy stops.
Right. The servers in Bangalore go dark, the garment factories in Dhaka stop running, the foreign investors panic, and the currency collapses. The speed of the car is the only thing keeping the economy upright.
Exactly. Breaking a high-carbon path dependency is astronomically expensive and politically perilous.
Because of the sunk costs.
Right. You have to write off billions of dollars in stranded assets.
Yeah.
Like coal plants that are only halfway through their operational lifespans.
While simultaneously spending hundreds of billions to build renewable grids.
And remember, they're being forced to navigate this transition at the exact historical moment when they are already suffocating under a $100 billion debt service burden.
It's the perfect storm. Which brings us to the conclusion, the crossroads.
The policy blueprint.
Right. We've gone through this incredible contradictory journey with the data. We've seen a billion people pivot from agriculture to services. They are riding this golden demographic wave. But they are severely weighed down by explosive debt, locked-in carbon, and vulnerable female and agricultural workers.
It's a precarious balance.
So what does this all mean? How do they actually escape this trap?
Well, the researchers don't just leave us with the doom and gloom. They offer a very specific three-pronged escape route.
Yeah, the visual for this is great. It's an infographic with 3 minimalist icons, a population tree, debt shackles, and a green gear.
Right, so the first pillar is shifting the capital.
Shifting away from the debt shackles.
Exactly. South Asia must pivot from attracting debt-based foreign capital to industrial investment foreign capital.
But you can't just politely ask the global markets for factories instead of sovereign loans, right? You have to build an environment that foreign investors actually trust.
That is the crux of the geopolitical challenge. Right now, they rely heavily on sovereign debt borrowing money to fund their deficits. That creates the black hole of interest payments we discussed.
Right.
The escape route requires foreign direct investment, or FDI. They need multinational companies to come in and build physical assets.
Like semiconductor plants, electric vehicle assembly lines?
Yes, high-tech manufacturing. Because an investor who builds a factory has skin in the game. They want the country to succeed.
Whereas a bondholder just wants their coupon payment, regardless of whether the country goes bankrupt the next day.
Precisely. FDI brings technology transfer, it brings global management practices, and it doesn't add to the sovereign debt burden in the same way.
But to attract it, South Asia has to ruthlessly cut red tape, stabilize their legal frameworks, and prove they have reliable infrastructure.
Which leads perfectly to the second pillar of the escape route, greening the grid. The green gear icon.
Right, and the report points out that they actually have the financial plumbing to do this now. We talked about how domestic credit expanded to 50% of GDP.
It's a massive resource.
The researchers argue they need to take that massive pool of domestic banking capacity and aggressively direct it toward funding a green energy transition.
Yes. They cannot rely on foreign dollar loans to build solar farms. That just worsens the debt trap.
Right.
They have to use their own domestic savings, generated by the demographic dividend, to fund the solar, wind, and modern grid infrastructure required to break the fossil fuel lock.
So if they can decouple their economic growth from their carbon emissions using domestic capital, they solve 2 crises at once.
Exactly. But none of that matters if the people can't do the jobs. Which brings us to the final pillar, reskilling the stranded. The population tree icon.
Right, because we spent a lot of time on the 34% of men trapped on tiny agricultural plots and the 76% of working women relegated to the vulnerable, informal economy.
If South Asia wants to move from low-end services to high-value industrial and tech sectors, they cannot leave half their population behind.
There has to be a push to convert their skills.
There must be a massive systemic push for adult education and vocational training. You have to give the underemployed farmer the technical skills to actually participate in the modern economy.
Like working in modern agribusiness or light manufacturing?
Yes. And you have to formalize the informal sectors so that women have access to actual banking, legal protections, and childcare, allowing them to fully participate.
It sounds like a monumental, almost impossible task to pull off simultaneously.
It is the greatest governance challenge of the century. But the ultimate conclusion of this research is stark. For South Asia today, the quality of growth has officially become much more important than the speed of growth.
Quality over speed.
They can no longer afford to just chase that top-line GDP number if the debt and carbon shadows keep growing exponentially alongside it.
Quality over speed. That is a profound takeaway. I want to thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the numbers shaping the future of over 1 billion people.
It's been a great discussion.
We've looked at the breathtaking scale of the miracle, and we've examined the cold mechanics of the trap. But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
What's that?
Well, we talked extensively about the demographic golden window, that scissors gap opening up, creating this massive surplus of workers.
Right.
But by definition, a window closes. Human biology dictates that eventually, this massive working generation will age, the elderly dependency ratio will shoot up.
The scissors will snap shut.
Exactly. So if South Asia's demographic golden window is strictly temporary, What happens to that $100 billion mountain of debt and that locked-in carbon grid if the window closes before they manage to shift to high-quality growth?
That's the billion-dollar question.
You have to wonder, is time their greatest asset right now, or is it their ticking clock? Keep questioning the numbers behind the headlines, keep looking for the shadows behind the arrows, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.